Thank you so much to all our speakers. If you could come up to the table for some questions. All right, so we've got 30 minutes for questions. Mike, Val, Richard, someone wave your hand when it's 12:45 so we can get to lunch. I don't want to keep you from lunch. But we have an amazing group of researchers with very different levels of expertise. And I don't want to be reductionist in my description of your work, but we basically have an ecologist, a chemist, and a physician on the same panel. So I'd really like to first ask, what do you see as the key connecting points among your work and how that relates to the One Health initiative and how we could work together more?
Well, first of all, if you don't have a healthy environment, healthy water, air, soil, you will never have healthy people. And if you don't have healthy ecosystems, the people who live in those ecosystems have no prayer of being healthy. So I think protecting and preserving the life support system of the living earth is where we have to start if we have any hope of any of us being healthy for any other reason.
Yeah, well, I'll speak in sort of medical training and education. I think we probably need more symposia and forums like this. And we need more of this type of work, I think, incorporated into our professional meetings and our professional education. So I would say bringing parties together, and that's easy to say, but it's difficultly challenging to do. I think within medicine, we could start by bringing our medical colleagues together, and I don't think people outside of medicine really appreciate the extent to which human medicine is so highly balkanized. And we live in the infectious disease world; it's how we practice, but critical care physicians, pulmonary physicians, pediatricians have altogether different takes on antimicrobial use, different issues. And oftentimes within medicine, we're not speaking the same language. So when I talk about medicine getting its own house in order, I think that's something we need to do as a profession, communicate among ourselves. In infectious diseases, stewardship only works if you educate clinicians as to why you're doing what you're doing. Being the antibiotic police and saying no doesn't work, particularly since U.S. physicians are accustomed to doing whatever they pretty well damn well please. So, we have to do a better job among ourselves and then a better job with our other professional colleagues.
And yeah, I agree with all of those comments, and I would just like to add that symposium like this, I think, really help foster that collaboration. So really collaboration across sectors and disciplines. We're doing it a lot at the university level, but I think it's really important to do it on a much broader scale as well.
Thank you. So we haven't talked much about climate change yet today, and it came up. So how do we balance health, feeding a larger population, a growing global population, and reducing our carbon footprint? And I think this is especially a concern in low-income communities who are still having a problem just getting the proper nutrition. So, thoughts on that, many of you?
Can you repeat that question?
Oh, yeah. So I was wondering, just talking about climate change, how we balance, I think today we're talking about many topics, how we balance health, feeding a larger population, and reducing our carbon footprint. And I think I was saying this is especially an issue in low-income communities who are still having a problem just getting proper nutrition and access to food.
Sure. So there's lots of different climate mitigation strategies that are related to diets. And so a lot of the sustainable diet strategies are linked to lower greenhouse gas emissions. So, for example, eating plant-based diets or primarily plant-based diets, contributes a lot to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Also, choosing certain foods in the way they're grown. For example, choosing foods from like a more diversified agricultural system, like an agroforestry system where there's carbon sequestration, can also help with food choices that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And also just thinking about like the packaging of food waste, and overall like sourcing local. And so if that's possible.
I think one of the main things to understand is that the pattern of where fertile ground is will change as the heat of the planet increases in areas that are currently heavily agricultural. We're already seeing this in the Midwest. You had a graph up there that showed a big red stripe in the middle of our own corn belt, wheat belt. Preserving fertile ground in places where it will be, like Western Pennsylvania, should not be fracked, should not be paved, should not be converted to industrial uses because it is a critical food shed for the future. And also shifting agriculture into regenerative agriculture practices, which restore the fertility of the ground and sequester carbon, is a huge possible way of pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and putting it into the ground in a way that is productive and helpful. And then local food growing, putting gardens in communities. You reduce the transportation burden for moving food around. You reduce the packaging burden. And all of those have carbon footprints that I think we can avoid significantly.
So I'll just say about climate change is that this has already had a profound effect on infectious diseases, and I think it's been sub-radar. And part of it is just so much bloody news, and you're hit with the bombardment. And this is long game kind of stuff, similar to the emergence of antimicrobial resistance and realizing a decade later you have no drugs. It's going to be the same thing with climate change. So what we've seen over the past decade, just take one example, if you look at fungal disease, there's been an absolute explosion in human and animal fungal disease. And you've got two phenomena. You've got heretofore unrecognized fungi that are causing human disease. And you may have read CDC reports and other news reports say, for the example of Candida auris, as this pan-resistant yeast now that we can't treat. This happened environmentally in India and Southeast Asia. We don't know how it began. That's one phenomena. The other phenomena is you've had previously rare fungi that have emerged in new parts of the world. And the classic example of that is there's a species of Cryptococcus that used to be seen in New Zealand and Australia associated with eucalyptus trees and caused meningitis in a small number of patients. And then all of a sudden, a decade ago, it was found in, of all places, the Pacific Northwest, Seattle. And this is Cryptococcus gattii, which is now found worldwide. So you've got existing fungi that have moved into new ecosystems. And I think that the prevailing view is that climate change has played a large role in the explosion. These are, after all, environmental molds at like warm temperature, mildew, water, and all the stuff we're doing. A third phenomenon, as you increase environmental natural disasters, you've seen an explosion of fungal infections after the floods in Houston, after the Joplin tornado, where people are exposed through environmental dirt and water exposure directly to their person. And these things have increased, and they're only going to increase, I think, further. It'll probably take something like, something that involves tens of thousands of people as opposed to a few hundred or a few thousand to really get into people's consciousness. And by then, it'll probably be, too late to mitigate. Sorry,
So we've got some questions from the audience. Will organic farming alone sustain the local and global population?
Okay, I think organic farming is the salvation of our population worldwide, because you do not get healthy people with poisoned food, and you do not get healthy people from poisoned ground. And I think the need for commercial pesticide and herbicide processes is overrated because they don't count the costs to water degradation. They don't count the costs to the nutritional decline that happens with repeated use of chemicals in the land. You never give the land a chance to recover. So I would contend that organic culture is really the better way to provide food to more people, not the worst way.
And I wanted to add that organic is one mode of sustainable agriculture, and there's also a lot of other specific agricultural practices that may contribute to ecosystem services more than just organic farming. And so organic is just one part. It's one part of sustainable agriculture. So thinking about like diversified agriculture or restorative agriculture, as you were talking about before. And now more and more organic farming is becoming more accessible to a larger number of people in different income classes.
I think this is directed at Neil. How do you feel about using fecal transplants to re-inoculate gut and digestive microbiome to combat antibiotic resistance?
Yeah, right. So this is going to explode over the next 5 to 10 years. And fundamentally, what we're learning more and more is the microbiome, and particularly the gut microbiome, drives absolutely everything. And therapeutic manipulation of the microbiome, whether it's fecal transplant, probiotics, or more tailored kind of approaches, as we learn more about how to connect microbiome specifically to health and disease states, and we can make rational interventions on microbiome restoration. New York Times, Sunday Times, 2 weeks ago had a huge article on the pharmaceutical industry and other people muscling to get into this space. So the pharmaceutical industry has zero interest in developing new antibiotics, but they are all over microbiome manipulation. So it's going to be massive. The other thing that's out there is completely unregulated people just doing it as a business and selling stuff right now, which is a whole other discussion.
Right. So to follow up on that, it really does seem very trendy right now to talk about your microbiome. Dr. Who mentioned last night about a program you can buy. You can pay a lot of money to analyze your own microbiome and have a personalized diet. How do we balance out, how do we separate out fact from fiction here, what we know already?
Well, you don't go to the internet and do what you read on the internet. That's rule number one. I think you're just going to have to wait for the field to mature and get there, and that's very tough. I'll give you an example. I have a sister who has an autistic son, and she's gotten very into this about stuff that's being said with autism out there. It's hard to tell a mother, wait 5 to 10 years so we can learn what we're doing, get the clinical trial data, because people are going to try it, because conventional medicine can't give them an answer right now. But in the grand scheme of it, in the sweep of human history, 5 to 10 years is nothing. But until we get the real data and we know what we're doing, you run the risk then of doing real harm, because you're going to do manipulations that change inflammatory and immune responses without knowing what you're doing, and it'll be deleterious. I might say one area that's gotten really big, and the potential of the microbiome to deal with resistance, for example, is that resistant pathogens can but they largely flourish in states of dysbiosis. So the best defense about getting colonized or infected with a resistant pathogen is having a healthy microbiome, because then it can't flourish and compete. So the fact that the American diet is as bad as it is, and our microbiomes are as bad as it is, makes it easy for these type of bugs to get in there and colonize. And it'll be interesting to see, like in Southeast Asia, where they've had a massive problem with this, can we learn something about microbiomes there and diets there, and you say bring it to here and begin to make sense of the emerging data. So we'll see. But I'd invest in microbiome companies and what have you, because that's going to be, there's my free tip. And I have no conflict with that either.
There was no conflict with the medical society there, so. I think this is directed at Dr. DeMarco. Is there evidence suggesting that the explosive rise in gluten sensitivity stems from GMO wheat and Roundup?
I have no information about that. I'm sorry.
So how do antibiotics work as growth promoters? Are there mechanisms besides avoiding disease? Might they promote growth or obesity in children?
So the prevailing thought is that they worked by prophylacting against subclinical infections or infections. But in fact, what's becoming clear is it's, again, the microbiome. I think what you're doing is you're manipulating microbiome. You're getting more a favorable immune and inflammatory balance. We're not sure how that's exactly happening, and that's actually a very active area of research. But I think at the end of the day, that's what it gets to. The thing about the growth promotion literature, if you actually look at it, is I think a lot of the benefit is antibiotics are a proxy for just good animal husbandry. And it's controversial how much actual gain you get in growth if you practice good husbandry. the literature would suggest you only get about 1 to 10% additional gain through the use of antibiotics. So this is the kind of education I think you have to do. 41% of the world still allow antibiotic use as simple growth promoters. So the education you do is if you practice good husbandry, actually you'll achieve the same effect. And you won't have these untoward effects. And the resistance also impacts the animals. It's not merely what they might be doing to us. So it's in their interest, even if they don't care about what they're doing to humans, to limit resistance in animals. And it's probably not even doing all that much good.
Question, do you see a place for using phage therapy to combat antimicrobial resistance?
Yes, I mean, this is a really hot area as well. The problem with phage, and we've had a couple cases at UPMC with patients similar to the one I presented, is that right now it takes a long time because you've got to tailor the phage to the bug. And there are places that can do this, but basically it's a 2-month manufacturing process. Given the specificity of phage, can you make this sort of a real player in the economic marketplace? Well, you have phage that'll work broadly against different types of bugs with different types of resistance, and it's not clear you can. The other challenge right now is phage benefit, if it's been there in human cases where it's been used, has been short-acting, and eventually the benefit of it, the activity of it wears off. So can you get long-acting effects? But that's a very dynamic area of interest, and another area that drug companies are actually interested in, because you could potentially use phage to deliver a lot of stuff. So they may not be concerned about the resistant infections, but if they can get delivery systems, maybe they can do something that'll, make your hair grow longer or lose weight, something people really care about.
Thank you. So let's talk pollinators. What are beekeepers doing given there are many Roundup-ready crops? Bees travel up to 2 miles for nectar and pollen, and then we also should consider these large-scale beekeepers who are moving to pollinate fields across the country.
Beekeepers are under attack in a lot of ways, and I know we have beekeepers in our neighborhood, and she walks around to make sure that people aren't using herbicides and pesticides on our yards because she wants to be sure her bees are not sick. And on a commercial scale, this is a huge problem because the problem of you can't prove that my chemical killed your bee has been going on. And even when things like the neonicotinoids have been demonstrated to weaken or completely kill off bee populations or bee colonies, the EPA has rescinded some of the protections that have been adopted in recent years. So there is a commercial interest from the growers who are using these broad-scale pesticides, especially in maintaining what they're considering best practice. They don't worry about the drift. They don't worry about the pollinators. And they're not really looking at what it would cost to replace pollinators. I know there's some research going on now where you can have drones that will act like bees because the almond crops are being, less than optimum since the pollinators are suffering not just from the pesticides but also from the drought. And migrating bee populations from place to place to place as a service has been common in the industry now for a number of years, and it is considered to be part of the contributors. The stress on the bees, not having them a time to rest and hibernate as their normal cycle would, has been one of the things they're looking at as contributing to colony collapse. So I think as a harbinger of our fate, the extinction of insect species that is going on, and people say, I don't care if they kill the bugs. What difference does it make? I don't like bugs. You've heard people say they don't like bugs. We need to think about that interconnectivity, and pollinators are a critical part of so many food chains, not just for people, but for many other creatures. I think a challenge, an attack to the collapse of bee colonies is a real big warning sign, worse than a canary in a coal mine. I think it's a huge red flag that we should be paying much more attention to than we are.
Patty, are you still doing the bug camp out at the Rachel Carson Institute to promote bugs among?
I haven't been at the
bugs?
Rachel Carson Institute for a while, but we did put the Sense of Place Learning. My colleagues did put Bug Camp up as a kit for teachers, and it's still available on the internet. Not free anymore, though. But I recommend Bug Camp. I mean, little kids love bugs, and even kids who grow up in the city, when they came out to the Rachel Carson homestead for a week at a time for day camp, getting them to not be afraid of caterpillars crawling on their hands or looking for grasshoppers in the weeds. I mean, it really it makes your heart sing, to see kids get excited. They'd come running into my office. I found a bug. I don't know what it is, and help them figure out, what kind of a bug they have. It's a real uplifting thing. Everybody should do it.
Yeah, here at Phipps we have a bug camp, and I can also attest, kids love bugs. You just have to start them early. Okay, so we have time for one last question. I'm wondering about, someone is asking about the impact of monocultures on the future of our food supply. And actually, to extend that, how much are you seeing these kind of integrated crop rotation styles returning to conventional agriculture, given that we know it can be really beneficial to the environment?
Absolutely. There's a really promising trend of increase in diversified agriculture and reduction in monoculture farming. So even though monoculture farming is the dominant way of production globally, more and more, especially at a community level, there is a wonderful increase. And I think that's one of, it's very promising for the future, the sort of push towards more diversified farming systems. And I think we all become very familiar with organic certification, and now there is more of a push for certification that takes biodiversity more into account, that really fosters more of a One Health perspective. So I think it's a really promising trend for the future.
Great. Well, thank you, Selena. Thanks again to all our speakers.